Hi everyone, we are starting our new topic of crime and deviance. In today's lesson we're just going to be defining what crime is and what deviance is, what's the difference between the two, and how to tell whether an act is criminal or deviant according to time, place and social situation. So just as our sort of starter activity, have a look at the images and decide which ones you think are criminal. So hopefully you've had some time to think about those and think about what the definition of what a crime actually is. Obviously I can't go through each of the images with you because I'm not with you, but hopefully you can come back to this slide at the end once you've got the definitions and see if you agree. So firstly I want you to think about what a criminal looks like. What are some of the key characteristics or features? Do you think there is anything particular what a typical criminal would look like? Think about the type of crime that perhaps somebody might do. So would a typical criminal who commits a street crime compared to perhaps a corporate crime be the same? Think about a criminal that might commit an act such as a domestic violence crime. Do they have particular features? Also think about if there is anything you could do without with some sort of assurance that you wouldn't be detected, you wouldn't be held responsible, you wouldn't be caught, what would you do? Because this kind of links to what we're going to be doing later when we think about sanctions in terms of crime and deviance. And does prison work? So is prison the only thing that is stopping us from breaking the law? So if you're watching this from home, I'd like you please to pause the video here and watch the two YouTube clips about two crimes that took place recently. What you need to do is just fill out the table. So what's the story? So describe what is happening. Then think about what do you think the causes for this type of crime could be? And then is it easy or difficult to measure this type of crime? So think about, is it easy to know how much of this type of crime is occurring? What are some of the barriers to perhaps being able to know how much of this crime is occurring, whether it's going up or whether it's going down? The middle clip is not a clip, it's actually a brief news article. So that one you just have to read and fill in the table in exactly the same way. So our key terms then for the lesson are crime. So a crime is any act that goes against the law, and deviance is any act that goes against the norms and values of society. Sometimes an act can be both, so it can be criminal and deviant, and sometimes it can be just one but not the other. So can you think of an act that is criminal? Can you think of an act that is perhaps deviant? Can you think of an act that is deviant but not criminal? So something that we perhaps all agree is wrong but isn't in fact a crime. So just thinking of that, think about, for example, sitting next to somebody on a bus, even though the bus is empty. Would that be a criminal act or a deviant act? Well, obviously it doesn't break the law. You can sit next to somebody on a bus if you like, but arguably we'd say it's deviant, particularly now during the pandemic and social distancing. It would be considered a deviant act. They've not broken the law, but we all agree that it is a little bit weird if someone was to sit next to you on an empty bus. Also thinking about the starter activity, there was a picture of a guy with tattoos and piercings all over his face. Again, it's not an act that goes against the law, but most people would see it as perhaps a deviant act because usually we would agree that it's not normal behaviour to tattoo your entire face and might go against some of the values of society. So can you think of an act that is criminal but not deviant? So that one's slightly harder. So if you think about speeding, often people speed. If you're speeding perhaps at 75 miles an hour on a motorway, technically it's breaking the law and you could be punished for doing so, but most people would say it's not potentially deviant because it's only slightly above the speed limit and lots of people do it. So how can definitions of crime change or definitions of deviance change? So looking at the left-hand side, you can see some statements. Think about whether these acts are criminal, deviant, or if they're actually acceptable. So let's pick one out. So wearing a real fur coat, arguably we would say in the UK this is considered to be deviant. It's not illegal, so it's not a crime, but most people tend to agree now that wearing real fur isn't acceptable. Driving past a school at 60 miles an hour, obviously it's illegal. You can't, usually it's 20 or 30 miles an hour outside schools. So we would say that's probably going to be one that's breaking the law and therefore criminal. However, if we reveal some more information about these situations, it perhaps changes things. So driving past the school at 60 miles an hour in an ambulance on an emergency call would not be therefore a criminal act, or it wouldn't be deviant either, so it would therefore become an acceptable act. The unmarried couple living together in modern day times would be seen as perfectly acceptable, but perhaps in the 1800s might not have been seen as acceptable. So essentially what we're trying to say here is that whether an action is seen as criminal or deviant can depend on three things: the time, so when the act takes place, the place, so where the act takes place, and the culture, so the cultural context of the act. So what we're saying essentially is that crime is a social construction. We create the rules or the laws of the land, and therefore it is created by us. So all I want you to do is, in your books, just copy down time, place, culture as the three things that can change the definition of an act, and that part there, that crime is a social construction, and make sure that you put an example for each. So for the one that says time, you can use the example of the unmarried couple, or the one of being in a homosexual relationship in the 1950s, because the time is what has changed that act. The place, so you can use the example of wearing a real fur coat during winter in Russia, because depending on where you live, it might be more acceptable to do a particular act. And then for culture, you can use most of these, to be honest. You might want to use the one smoking a cigarette while pregnant. It depends on the cultural context. So when does an act become deviant? So if you could just jot this down in your exercise books, please. So sociologists argue that what is considered deviant does not depend on the act itself, but the way people respond to the act. So crime is therefore a social construction, as is deviance. So selling drugs is likely to be seen as deviant and even criminal if done on a street corner, but normal and acceptable if done by a pharmacist at a chemist. So it's not the act of selling drugs that's a problem, it's the context. What drugs, by who and where? In a pharmacist, obviously it's seen as acceptable, it's regulated, it's above board, it's not against the law. But if you change that context to different types of drugs, or even the same drugs but sold by an individual that is not qualified, not in a pharmacy but on a street corner, the act becomes deviant and criminal. So it's important when considering cross-cultural evidence. This is because norms and values differ across different cultures. So if you think about cultural norms in the USA, so carrying guns in public, it's seen as culturally more acceptable. What is seen as appropriate dress for men and women, perhaps in Saudi Arabia compared to the UK. And if you think about assisted suicide in Switzerland, those acts are not, they're going to be different compared to the UK because the norms and values of the countries are different. So can you think of any other examples of acts that are considered normal in other countries that would be seen as potentially deviant in the UK? So this is a type of practice question that you could get on your exam. So one example of deviant behaviour, 3 marks. So you'd get 1 mark for correctly identifying a correct example of deviant behaviour. So obviously you want an example that isn't one that's illegal. You want one that's purely legal but goes against the norms and values of society. Then you want a further 2 marks for describing why it's deviant and not criminal behaviour. So you would obviously say, that this act is deviant, it is in line with the law, but it goes against the norms and values of society, and you'd want to describe why. So what is it that is perhaps deviant about it? So I've got 2 examples here. So answer 1, one example of deviant behaviour would be speeding. This is considered deviant because it's frowned upon in society to do this. Answer 2, one example of deviant behaviour would be sitting next to a stranger on an empty bus. This behaviour is considered deviant because it goes against the norms and values of society, but it's not illegal as it does not break any laws. So obviously you can see that answer 2 is a little bit better, A, because it uses the key terms of norms and values, but also it clearly contrasts it with what illegal or criminal behaviour is. So for the plenary, I want you to think about whether these examples are crimes, deviance, or both. So murder, using a fake ID to get into a club, reading a partner's text messages, parking on double yellow lines, or alcohol dependency. Also think about what deviant behaviours that we currently have, what ones do you think might become more acceptable in the future? Is there anything that you think at the moment is frowned upon but slowly over time will become more and more acceptable? And I've just put that picture there of two women shopping in Tesco in their pyjamas because there was a lot of articles about that a couple of years ago, and it led to Tesco's actually putting up signs saying that people couldn't shop in their pyjamas because it was seen as unacceptable, it was seen as deviant behaviour. And I've put that picture there, similar to the one at the starter. Do we think that maybe piercings and tattoos on our faces will become more acceptable in the future or not? So once you've done this lesson, if you're at home and you're working from home, please just send it to me via email or upload it on Show My Homework. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Thanks, bye.